Welcome to this video podcast. In collaboration with the Royal Swedish Academy of War Sciences and its project SVAR, we explore Sweden's path into NATO and the EU, as well as issues of deterrence and resilience. How are these affected by NATO membership, developments in the USA, and the war that Russia initiated against Ukraine in 2014, which escalated into a full-scale invasion in 2022? In recent years, questions about nuclear deterrence have increased, especially after Donald Trump's second presidential term in the USA. What can we really expect from US support in an existential crisis? Is it enough for Europe to double its defense spending, or will the demands for European efforts increase before the USA provides the necessary backstop on conventional and nuclear levels? Against this background, a discussion about European nuclear deterrence, primarily linked to the French nuclear weapons, has blossomed in Europe. With us today is Lars Wedin, former captain in the Swedish Navy and a long-standing member of the Academy, known for his groundbreaking work in strategic studies. He is also an associate member of the French Académie de Marine, thus having unique opportunities to consult with French experts. The conversation begins with references to an article from the journal War on the Rocks about the French nuclear weapons. The article presents theses that are then tested through scenario descriptions with critical questions from a devil's advocate perspective. Lars Wedin will then provide a synthesis that we hope can give opinion leaders and decision-makers in Sweden a basis for taking a stand on the issue. In the final part of our podcast, Michael Sahlin, member of the Academy and with a broad security policy background as State Secretary in the Ministry of Defense and Ambassador in several key positions in Europe, will participate. He will place the issue in a larger security policy context and pose further questions about how Russia and the USA might react if the French nuclear weapons become a deterrent factor for most of Europe.
Just to get into the topic now, looking at the initial questions of Alexander Zog's article, what if the United States decided to fold up its nuclear umbrella over Europe? Could that lead to increased Russian aggression against Europe? Could it be an existential threat to the European Union? Could it lead to nuclear proliferation? Challenge the non-proliferation order? Or could it, by way of the French nuclear arsenal, help to prevent both? The question about the viability of such an umbrella is now under discussion. But in this podcast, we will go one step further, open the door to a second part of the discussion, which could be, what if the French and the Brits and the Europeans agreed to set up such an umbrella? The weapons already exist. What does that mean that together with 5% for defense in Europe, that would create a European power which would be more independent from the American superpower than currently expected in Washington? What would that lead to in terms of Russian reactions? Are we then, in view of such a possibility, going to see a new set of American policies and counter-policies in order to maintain its power and its influence in Europe and around Europe? And would that in turn lead to less of a pivot to Asia than currently is being discussed? We have a feeling in this podcast that the second part of the discussion has hardly started yet. Still, there is a lot of more or less primitive considerations about nuclear proliferation. This is not nuclear proliferation, what we're talking about here. France and UK are already nuclear weapons powers recognized in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's also not necessarily something quite new. The weapons already exist. What is new is a notion that this could actually form the basis of a deterrence together with a strengthened conventional defense in Europe, which would make Europe more independent, something which Europeans don't want. But what is left maybe as an option, should the American willingness to provide a backstop both in Ukraine, in Europe as a whole, and globally, both on the conventional and the nuclear levels, if all of this would not come true, if Trump would try the hat trick of bringing forward more European defense capabilities in order to stop paying for those capabilities through American taxpayers, but finds out that in the end he will lose so much influence on top of everything else that he has already lost in terms of soft power, etc., that he might have to reconsider his positions. We are not going to be able to finish this discussion in this podcast, but maybe it is at least a start. So welcome to the discussion with Lars Wedin and Michael Sahlin.
Modern missiles, strategic missiles, have several warheads, so the number of warheads and number of missiles are not the same. Well, the United States have many more strategic nuclear missiles than France and UK. And first observation, of course, is that the US wanted to deter not only Russia, but also China, North Korea, maybe Iran, while France nuclear deterrence is directed against Moscow. Secondly, the British, I will say some words about the British nuclear weapons just in the beginning. So the British have 4 strategic ballistic missile submarines, of which one is always on patrol. And they have their missiles are American, Trident II, but their warheads are British. It is not clear how dependent this nuclear force is on the United States regarding decisions. It has a dependence regarding logistics of these missiles, but what that entails for the strategic use is not known. Formally, at least, the British missiles are, like all countries' missiles, sovereign. It is not known either if the Brits may be able to surge the number of submarines at sea, as we know that the Royal Navy has big human problems with keeping their personnel and recruiting personnel. And finally, the last 2 tests of the British submarine launched missile, the Trident, has not worked very well. So, and finally, the British nuclear weapons are integrated into NATO. They are discussed, and their role is discussed in the NATO's nuclear planning group. By contrast, France then has about the same number of nuclear-tipped missiles as the UK. It has also 1 submarine always on patrol. It may surge, which I did in February 22, when the Russian attack against Ukraine developed. Then they took out 3 submarines at sea at the same time. It was the first time they ever did it, what I know. And a typical patrol by a French nuclear submarine is 60 days. And when they change, as a new submarine goes on patrol, that requires a big anti-submarine warfare operation in order to see that there are no foreign submarines present. And then the submarine itself will be diluted, as they say, in the water. So France has much fewer nuclear weapons than the United States. What does that entail? Well, to begin with, you don't count strategic nuclear missiles as you count battle tanks or destroyers or things like that. When I went for the French Naval War College, I learned that the French nuclear forces would be able to kill about 50 million Russians, or the Soviets at that time. That is about 1/3 of the Russian population. I would argue that if the possible loss of 1/3 of its population would not deter Putin, I don't think a possibility to kill 100 million or all 160 million Russians at the same time would really change the deterrent effect of the nuclear weapons. So I think from that point of view that the French nuclear weapons are enough. Then, of course, numbers matter. If you have more nuclear weapons, the chance that you get them through missile defense and everything works is, of course, higher, but it's not proportional. So when you cannot say that the fact that the Americans have 5,000 and the French have 250 something strategic missiles says really something about the deterring effect. And by the way, the Americans' number will probably be able to kill each one of us on the Earth's surface twice. And we know that's only James Bond who lives twice. Most of us dies only once. So that's my answer to the first question. Then we go to the other, that was the deterrence by punishment, also that which is a domain of strategic nuclear warfare. When we come to the strategy of denial, we come to defense. And there is an enormous difference, an important difference between the American, which is the NATO strategy, regarding defense and nuclear weapons. According to the flexible response doctrine, then the battlefield nuclear weapons, I don't think one uses the word tactical nuclear weapons today so much, but anyway, it's about the same thing, are linked to the conventional defense. But in French doctrine, the smaller nuclear weapons, so to say, are not linked to defense. They are linked to the strategic level as a last warning. And that's why they're called pre-strategic and not battlefield. And this is a doctrine which has been in place all the time since the French nuclear forces became operational in the 70s. France refuses nuclear warfare. And France then have a missile, ASMP, which you see here on the picture when on board one of the French Navy's Rafale fighter aircraft taking off from probably the French nuclear carrier de Gaulle. And this is a missile with a lower yell. It's a rather long distance, 300 kilometers, and it's meant to deliver the last warning. I will come back to what that means in reality. So that was the first question.
So when you say the first question here, if you look at where are we now in the structure that you made?
Now number two.
Number
So
two.
this is a rather curious idea. So that Paris is much closer to Moscow than Washington. Hence, there is a problem of deterrence. And I will say, well, that Paris has been where it is for 2,000 years. Moscow has been where it is since 900 years. And when de Gaulle and the French organized and constructed its nuclear forces, the distance has been the same all the time. So that is, so to say, incorporated in the French doctrine. Of course, we could say that the warning time will be somewhat longer in Washington than in Paris. I'm not sure that the warning time will be so much longer in Washington than in Paris. That really means a practical difference.
Okay.
So then the third, that France's nuclear policy prohibits deploying atomic weapons beyond its borders. No. France's nuclear weapons, they are onboard submarines, strategic submarines. Such a submarine never goes to a foreign port. It goes to sea and to its base in Brest. It can be on aircraft, on the carrier, or normal Air Force airplanes. Such an airplane could, of course, land, make a tactical landing, well, on an airbase in Sweden with a nuclear weapon. That is quite possible, and it's not prohibited. To base nuclear weapons for a longer time, that would, of course, entail a lot of structure working to have them safe and so on, and that no one has, what I know, looked into such a question. There is a new nuclear sharing program in France regarding Europe. So I don't think that question is really relevant. The question number 4 is also a bit awkward. I would say France and UK are fundamentally different nuclear arsenals. I really don't see that. Let's say United States has a triad. There are air-launched, land-launched, submarine-launched. France has a dualad, or what it's called, that can launch nuclear weapons from aircraft and from submarines, not from land-based. France had that capability until some 20 years ago, but they abolished it because they believe, in my view correctly, that having missiles in fixed bases make them much too vulnerable. The big difference is that US has about 100 nuclear bombs, the B-61, in Europe in its nuclear sharing program, and France has no nuclear bombs. And from my perspective, this is a pure political thing. It means that some NATO members have American nuclear bombs on their territory, which would hopefully, so to say, link them more closely to the United States. But of course, a pilot taking off with a nuclear bomb, of course, knows that he will probably not come back. So I don't see that this issue is really a problem either. Timeline.
Could you hold there a minute, Lars? When you say it's not a problem, does that mean that, in fact, the closeness of France to Russia and the fact that they don't have gravity bombs, where the platform which will deliver the bomb, the aircraft, is almost sure to be lost during the mission. Do these two facts
Yeah.
not, in reality, increase deterrence? Actually, rather point to the fact that the French will more quickly respond to a Russian aggression than the Americans are likely to do.
So there's an asymmetry here. Paris is closer to Moscow than Washington. That's a fact. The nuclear submarines are about the same distance because the missiles have about the same range.
Yeah.
American missile submarine launched ballistic missile boats are in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. And they will, and in the Atlantic at least, they try to hide them under the now melting polar ice. I don't know exactly where France nuclear submarines are deployed normally. That's a big secret, of course, but it's around the same. I know a friend of mine has his passing the polar line certificate made on a submarine. So I know that the French nuclear submarines are also in the Arctic.
Yes. No, but
Exactly where and so on, we don't know.
that was not my question, Lars. The question was that when you said that the nuclear gravity bombs used by the Americans in Germany and so on and deployed there are political. That was, I
Yeah.
think, the word that you use.
Uh,
And I suppose that you mean that they are political because their deterrence is not in reality that great.
yeah. So no, I don't think so. I think that the idea, even of the newest B-61, is some kind of glide bomb. Anyway, it means that you have to come pretty close to your target. And what is the target of a nuclear bomb? It's probably not the forces that are on so the closest front. It is rather headquarters, logistic hubs, and so on. Behind the front, so they will need to pass through the first echelon of Russian forces, and that will be dangerous to say the least.
Yeah.
Uh, but I understand that these countries have these bombs because it's a, so to say, a token of U.S. deterrence of U.S. What is called friendship and so on, more than an actual warfighting capacity. That's what I think.
Okay. So if we move on a little bit, uh, you have argued that the number is not the issue here. The issue is whether you are actually able to inflict an unacceptable damage on the other side. But then the question is, well, in number 6 here, would a more robust European defense be dangerous, be perceived as dangerous? Would it be actually provocative? Would it lead to increased tension, arms race, or dangerous counter strategies?
I think this is a very interesting question, and the Swedish Colonel Bo Hugemark has written about this issue a long time ago. It is often said that if the weaker party uh, increases its readiness, increases its warfare capacity, so to say, the potential aggressor would be provoked by this. And it, of course, in the interest of the potential aggressor, in our case Russia, to inform others about this issue. If you rearm or to strengthen your defense, I will feel threatened, so I will attack you. Okay, so this is a classic issue, but it is called false. To say that is to go in Russia's tracks and follow their logic. Of course, we need to rearm and defend, because that would mean maybe that Russia sees as a window of opportunity that will be closed and so on and so forth. But I don't think that is really relevant. It is important that Europe has more robust defense, and that is, of course, not to the liking of the people in Moscow. But we have to do that anyway.
So then we come to the second part, I think, of your questions. How can we expect the reaction of the other European states? How will that unfold? Will this be an acceptable situation for other European states? Will there be something quite different from having an American nuclear umbrella?
So it is not only a question for other Europeans; it's also a question for France. So let's go back a bit. The issue of a European vocation for France nuclear weapons has been discussed from time to time already since the Maastricht Treaty, as the Maastricht Treaty has a line about a possible common European defense, and a common European defense has to be nuclear for obvious reasons. So that this has been discussed for a very long time. But the official doctrine has all the time been that those are called three circles, which were an idea by General Poirier, who was the one who wrote the French doctrine in the 70s, a person which has he's been a kind of mentor for me. So I've had the possibility to discuss these issues with him. And the first cycle is the sanctuary, France territory, France European territory, so to say. What was defended by France nuclear forces. The second is Europe, and the third circle is the rest of the world. But that has been now more and more questioned, and a couple of years ago, President Macron talked more clearly about a European vocation for French nuclear weapons. And as I understand it, many European countries are opposite to that. That goes for Germany with its new government, at least. But this is an issue that now is under discussion. It's not clear in France. The Rassemblement National with Marine Le Pen is clearly against an enlargement of the French nuclear umbrella. It's not clear from French side either, I would say. But of course, if I should perhaps make a comparison here, U.S. deterrent. So to what extent is the U.S. deterrent credible? Also, to what extent is it credible that U.S. government or the U.S. president will pull the bottom and risk to exchange Washington against Tallinn? Is that more credible than that France push the button and in exchange perhaps Paris for Tallinn. I mean, all the European states are all members of the European Union. We are not the federal states, of course, but we have a very much lot of common, particular economy. So I must say that the interest of France in the rest of Europe is much higher than the interest of the United States in Europe. And not to say about Trump. If Trump would change his mind now and say, well, we will clearly continue to defend Europe and the American deterrence covers Europe, will he be credible? I'm not sure. It will take some time before the United States become a credible partner. But I think this is something which is now is in the kitchen, and we will see where it will be boiled down. Anyway, in any case, France's nuclear weapons are sovereign. It will only be the French president that will decide on their use. Will only be he who says what is covered by the French deterrence. And if you ask Macron about what is covered by the French deterrence, he will answer, it's our vital interests. And when they then ask him, and what are your vital interests? He will not answer, because that's part of strategic ambiguity, which is a very important part of deterrence. United States president, except perhaps Trump, would say about the same thing. So the most important part, from my view, is that the French president says that yes, we have a European vocation without making it too clear exactly when and what. That is important. It is very important that he does not make the contrary, to say no. Europe or both the Baltic states or whatever is not covered, because then he opens the Pandora's box and there is no credibility left. But regarding the British nuclear weapons, they are integrated into European defense through the nuclear planning group, and they're also only strategic. So they fall, so to say, at this point in time out of the discussion. But if the policies of the U.S. government continues like this, we might see a more common nuclear deterrent force, UK and Britain. It was discussed before the Lancaster House Treaty in 2011, I think. But then they discussed to have common patrols. But that never became true. So, but there is a close relationship between French and British nuclear forces, as British weapons are tested in France.
Good. What do you say, Lars? Shall we ask Michael to go into the discussion now and more specifically look at the scenarios that we have listed here in the very end of the page. Also looking at what would be the American and the Russian reactions to a development whereby we would actually move towards an actual European deterrence system here. What would be the possible implications in terms of actions and reactions from Washington and Moscow? What do you say, Mika? Would that be an appropriate point to start the next part of our discussion?
I am very much puzzled by the current discussion about proliferation, benign proliferation of nuclear deterrence, and the concept of deterrence, in my view, has been blurred by the suddenness of the geopolitical changes that I think has shaken up many strategic thinkers in many capitals. We have, after all, nuclear weapons dictated or decided on by the persons now of Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and then of course Putin in Russia, and that in itself is very strange in many ways. We have a situation where Marco Rubio has, in today's NATO foreign minister meeting, declared full US commitment to NATO in all its varieties. That's what he's been saying today, for what it's worth. Others, analysts, like James Cameron, for example, who has written a very interesting article also, which I recently read, are saying that the concept of credibility, which is basic to any concept of nuclear deterrence, has been shaken, perhaps even irrevocably, in view of things that have been said. And by the way, today the world is shaken by the tariffs, enhancing further this sense that everything is new and everything is different and everything has to be rethought. So this would, and I'm now linking up to what Lars just said about the credibility of the US extended deterrence, which has been, I think, questionable all along, because any concern, any concept of nuclear deterrence, meaning a readiness for a nuclear exchange, unless you trust MAD to provide nuclear stability, such that the two sides, when it was two sides mainly, rely on their second strike capability to be somehow guarded and respected by the other side. If that is shaken, and if things that have been said and done by the current US administration means that as from January 20 this year, the US position in the global structure is different from what it used to be. Therefore, Europe cannot trust Article 5 any longer. Article 5 in the sense of nuclear deterrence and extended deterrence from the US using its nuclear triad arsenals. Then it is necessary for Europe to think of alternatives, not alternatives to what the US deterrence used to be, but alternatives to what is in the offing right now, with Article 5 commitment being shaken fundamentally, and therefore not to be counted on to be restorable after new elections in the US. So this whole thing, I think, means that the whole question of nuclear deterrence has to be rethought fundamentally. That includes, I think, also the question of nuclear sharing, because that has always given rise to the question, in whose interest is the deployment of those B-61s? Is it in the US interest to make sure that countries in Europe are committed and obedient, so to speak, to the US deterrent? Or is it the governments in those countries that want to make sure that there is a continued guaranteed US commitment to its deterrence? There are a host of questions now which are up in the air, and you have also to bear in mind not only the war and the nuclear threats from Russia, but you also have what Donald Trump has been saying about creating a shield of missile defense, similar to what Ronald Reagan had in mind in those days, which again will necessarily shake up any notion or any remnants of MAD, and therefore create counteractions and at least new questions about strategic stability. Then also you have the questions of proliferation and proliferation risks. In my view, but let me drop it as a question to you, Lars. There is a risk that if we, the Europeans, were to draw the conclusion that there must be now something, at least to complement lacking or weakening U.S. guarantees with some European responses in the nuclear area, then going there, and you have the difficulty of transition as well. What would it take, and what would be the reactions from both sides, U.S. and UK, and Russia, to the process or the indication, decisions being announced that we are going to do this, and the amount of vulnerability before you have an established deterrence that can be trusted. It is always a question of credibility. I see big questions there. And what would be the reaction in Japan and in South Korea if Europeans were to draw this conclusion from the lack of credibility of the US deterrent, the way things now look? And we are talking about what has been said and done by the US so far and what is being indicated as further signs of a weakening US commitment going forward for the next few years during, for starters, the Trump administration time, and then, of course, or you could say the midterm elections could provide perhaps a stopgap because the Democrats would resume command of the Congress. Maybe that could provide for a change and at least slowing of the trend in that direction. But still, signs are everything and credibility is everything, and I see great risks of proliferation being involved here. Let me stop there as my first comments.
But let me just push a question one step further, Mikael, because we asked in the presentation, we started from the question, what will be the reactions of Washington to a posture in Europe, actually, because we are talking about power here. We are talking about cementing the nuclear power status and the great power status, actually, of Paris and possibly also London as independent actors in the international system. We're not necessarily talking about proliferation, because they are already, according to the NPT, accepted as nuclear weapon powers. So we are maintaining the credibility of the NPT by this system. But the question is, what would President Trump say if his demand for more burden sharing will actually mean power sharing? He would. I mean, that's something which for me is incredibly difficult to foresee, but some sort of a reaction, I suppose we are. Maybe you could say a word about that, and maybe Lars could reflect on it.
Yeah, no, I heard you put that question. I never got to that point in my little presentation. There are so many unknowns and uncertainties even into this question, but it is my full conviction that, and we're talking about timing here also, how long time would it take? Would it be enough to react on declared intentions, which would take many years to fulfill as policy and as readiness for an own deterrence? I don't think that Trump or whoever comes after him, J.D. Vance or whoever, or some Democratic leader, but I don't see that coming anytime soon, unfortunately, would be very reluctant to welcoming. It's one thing to talk about burden sharing and now power sharing, as you say. But the US, I think, would be not completely happy if the concept of burden sharing and power sharing would lead to reduced US self-reliance as the only superpower, and would have to somehow share decision making when it comes to taking steps in that direction, even if they would say that it's only the president of the US that has the power to push the button. But if there are other buttons involved, you say it doesn't mean proliferation because they are already recognized. But still, I think there is a trend to proliferation inbuilt into this trend if it comes to that. And there will be James Cameron, for example, he's saying that the only possibility, in his view, is for the UK and France to create some jointness of autonomous Euro deterrence, because together they might be the bridge between extended deterrence by the US, whatever is left of it, and the risk otherwise of other countries like Poland to be tempted or feel obliged to almost to create their own nuclear deterrence, and that would be dangerous because they are neighboring countries, and that would limit the time scale for action reaction to almost zero. It's better to have a more withdrawn UK French deterrence that would be providing the bridge. But I don't think, Lars Erik, that the US, seeing that happening, would be entirely happy. It all depends on what kind of political distribution of power do we have in the world at that stage when this comes to fruition in real terms, not just declared intentions, but even intentions declared officially have political meaning,
Yeah,
and
Lars. Yeah,
would be a process.
yeah. Lars, what do you say?
Okay, I agree to most things that Mikael said,
Really?
surprisingly. But as a first, the issue of US nuclear weapons in Europe. Remember the NATO double decision from '82, and the big quarrel about the Euro missiles. It was the Europeans who wanted American missiles in Europe because with the American nuclear deterrent in Europe, they could pay less money on defense, put it bluntly. So I think that the nuclear weapons in which are now in Europe is, so to say, follow on to this issue, and maybe it is so also, as those weapons are in Europe, if whether they are credible or not, but withdrawing them would be a very sharp signal, and it could be seen as very very sharp signal. So uh, that was the first issue. The second issue is what would the United States say if the European rearmament comes through? Well, I think that Trump said something about that yesterday or something I saw in a paper. He has just said anyway that of course we should rearm by buying American arms. He's not very happy with the European defense funding of 800 billion euro. As we should buy American arms, of course, not European. But here I think Europe will go its own way. And that goes also for this issue. I talked with one of my friends who is a former French nuclear submariner, and the issue we discussed is would the US accept a situation where European nuclear weapons might be used. Also in a kind of tension situation. The US is not really in the crisis, but Europe is. Would United States accept that Europe uses nuclear weapons in deterrence at such point? And he said, no, America will not allow the Europeans to use nuclear weapons without Americans using it at the same time. So how that could be made, of course, could be discussed, and how vulnerable are the French and British submarines to American anti-submarine warfare. We don't know, but the vulnerability is never zero. So that's the second issue. Regarding the proliferation, I mean, it's amazing that we have seen articles in normally responsible Swedish papers that Sweden and the Nordic countries should get nuclear weapons. Now, if 1 year, 2 years, 5 years ago, people maybe laugh at such a question. Now that question is posed in earnest, and I think that is completely madness. It would take us. I have written about that in a note, so I don't come back to it now. But that would cost enormous lot of money. It would cost enormous lot of time, and I'm not sure. I'm very sure that Swedish government, Swedish armed forces will not be stand up to the requirements of readiness that a nuclear force would require. I don't think we do that. But anyway, I mean, the what is it called? The ghost is out of the bottle. And so now proliferation is discussed in earnest, and certainly, as I know it, also in Japan and in South Korea. And when Iran finally has its bomb, nuclear proliferation will come around. And then let's hope that the people who argued in the 60s that nuclear proliferation would not be such a bad thing. Also, if all countries have its own nuclear weapons, no one will really be able to use it, and that would be a stable situation. That is not an acceptable idea now, but it was once upon a time, and maybe it might become that again. I think we will see for the coming years, we will see a lot of discussion here, and I'm just a naval captain, so I don't have a crystal ball. You have to be a naval captain to get one, and so I have no idea where this will end. But the idea of a British-French kind of new nuclear force, which is paid for by also by European countries like Poland and Germany, might be a possible way out of this issue.
But then I think we should compare with the U.S.-Israel relations and the dilemma and the ambivalence that has characterized U.S. policy vis-a-vis the Israeli nuclear force, and the anxiety I think that has been expressed over the years that Israel should be tempted to use its nuclear arsenal against Iran without permission by the US. I think there is some interesting comparison that could be made here when it comes to reactions to, because the US normally would be hesitant to allow someone else to make the decision on going to the nuclear level, generally speaking. They would prefer to have that big step in its own hands. Let me also add, Lars-Erik, finally from me now, that we are in process of modernization. The US, I've been reading, is spending over 20 years, 1.7 trillion US dollars, occupying 20,000 engineers and everything in the modernization program of the triad. And I guess that the Russians are trying to cope or keep up with the tempo. That is also something which will ask or will put a question to policymakers in the U.S. So, given this, to what purpose would be used these modernized arsenals if the task is not also the defense of Europe? Would it be related only to the defense of the US with the ocean in between? You, Lars, said that it's not such a big difference, but if you compare to in terms of distance and time, therefore, but that's why I made the comparison with Israel, because Israel has very little time to counter incoming Iranian, maybe possibly nuclear-tipped missiles, whereas the U.S. has many times more time, and that makes a big difference between the two in terms of the cooperation in this field. So interesting comparisons are to be made. Modernization is going on. This will also raise the question of, so what purpose are we planning to use those nuclear forces for if you sit in Pentagon in today's world? That's it. That's it.
I think we are now getting close to 1 hour of this podcast. And I think it's time to wind up slowly. And I'd like to, there are so many different aspects that you have been sort of opening the door for to take into account, a lot of different dimensions. But I'd like to square in on one thing here, and that is the evolution of the discourse. My question to you is it not true to say that people are slowly open one door after the other in this discussion now? We started with the sort of the feeling that a war in Europe could not take place without nuclear weapons being used. That was the assumption for a long period during the Cold War. Then we had some conventional wars, but we still could not imagine a conventional war on the level that we have now seen in Ukraine over the last more than 10 years almost. Yes, more than 10 years. You would have thought that it would escalate at some point. And the risk has been there. It's been at least argued during the Biden administration that there was a risk for escalation. But slowly people gotten used to maybe we could have a protracted conventional war going on in Europe without actually an end. And then you get a new president in the United States who wants to put an end to this war in order to open up possibilities to deal with Russia as well and start a new phase. But in this process, he puts into question whether the United States needs to be responsible for the defense of Europe. He puts that into question. He gives away power. He thinks that asking the Europeans to pay up will mean continued American power without having to pay for it. And I think that we are now just in this podcast opening the door for the next discussion. Namely, will America keep its power when it has given up the control over what happens in Europe, opening up the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons? Even with the reservations you made, Lars, about that the unacceptability for the Americans that the French would actually contemplate seriously threatening with the use of nuclear weapons. Still is a question. Will there not be a counter-reaction in the United States? And will there not even be a counter-reaction into Moscow in a situation where we are here then going from a bipolar to to a multipolar power structure. Not yet proliferation, but actually that Europe becomes a real power player in this horrendous game of nuclear weapons. And I don't think we are there yet. I think that what you have said about Swedish nuclear weapons, for instance, Lars, is a very primitive. I think we must agree that it's a very primitive discussion. And we must also probably agree that what we have had so far is not a full scope analysis of deterrence in Europe. There is a new phase coming up now with the possible European. So what will this next step of the analysis mean? Things are going so fast that we really don't know how fast we will come into the situation that the Americans will actually start trying to project power. But can they project power in this domain without actually making a commitment themselves? Because so far we have seen nothing under the new administration in terms of reassuring allies that they have a commitment. They leave the second part of the sentence out when they ask the Europeans to pay more.